In our investigation of some of the controls, we'll start by looking at the simplest controls, and that includes border, button, checkbox, and radio button controls. We won't actually look at any programming code in these examples. Instead, we'll focus on properties of some of these common controls. The sample application allows you to interact with these various properties, but there's a lot of code behind the scenes, and you may find that code interesting. The sample application also displays the markup associated with the controls once you've chosen the various property values, and you may find that useful as well. You do need to watch out, though, because these controls have a huge number of properties. We can only introduce a few of those properties here and introduce the controls. You won't see any code, but the sample does include a lot of code, and you may find it interesting to dig through that code. Some techniques you'll find in the code, including some of the complex data binding, are beyond the scope of this discussion. We'll start by looking at the border control. The container controls you may have seen, like the grid or the stack panel, can contain multiple internal controls, but they have no means of displaying a visible border. For that, you use the border control. It accepts a single child control, and normally that control will be some kind of container, like a stack panel or a grid. And it displays a border around that child control. It's definitely a single-use control, but it does what it does well. It has a background property, which can be a brush of some sort. It can be a solid brush, or a brush that inherits from gradient brush, like a linear gradient brush or a radial gradient brush. The border brush property lets you specify the color or a brush for the border of the border control. There's a border thickness property. This border thickness property works much like the margin property you've seen on other controls. You can specify 1, 2, or 4 values. If you specify 1, you get the same border on all 4 sides. If you specify 2 values, you specify the thickness for the left and right in the first value, and the thickness for the top and bottom in the other. If you specify 4 values, you're getting a different border thickness on all 4 sides. You can specify the corner radius property, which allows you to specify a radius for all 4 corners or individually. So you could have a different rounded radius on each of the 4 corners if that's what you wanted. We'll be working with a linear gradient brush in this example. Many properties accept a brush or something that inherits from a brush as their property value. You can specify a solid color brush or a gradient brush. We'll focus on the linear gradient brush here, which has markup that looks something like this. You may have seen this already. In the border.background property, remember we have to use the object.property syntax because this property is too complex for a single attribute value. We specify a linear gradient brush element. Within there's a collection of gradient stops. Each gradient stop indicates a color and an offset from the edge of the control. Each gradient stop determines where a color appears. In this figure, the white goes from 0 to 1/4, the blend from 1/4 to 3/4, dark gray starts at 3/4 and continues to 1. And that's what that linear gradient might look like. You can even see in the image itself that I have controls that let you specify the stop location for each color. Here, white stops at 0.25, dark gray stops at 3/4 and extends from there. Now, if you want a diagonal gradient, you can specify start point and end point attributes. 0, 0 is the lower left corner, 1, 1 is the upper right corner. So if you do specify start point and end point attributes for the gradient brush, you can specify exactly where the gradient starts and stops on the edge of the container. Now you should also check out the radial gradient brush, which provides a circular gradient. Let's look at the border control and move on from there. I've loaded and run the sample project for this topic named Simple Controls, which is basically just a tab control that contains a number of user controls inside of it demonstrating each of the various controls we'd like to work with. I'm starting with the border control. And clearly what I have here is a border control containing a grid with a lot of stuff inside of it. I can set the border thickness property. Now I've limited the numbers 1 through 10. The border can be as thick as you like. It doesn't matter. And I can set a corner radius property. Again, I've limited this to 11 possible values, but you could choose any angle you like. And the larger the number, the larger the radius of the circle that creates the corner radius. And don't forget that you can use 4 different values for the corner radius. I'm using a single value at this point. We can specify the border brush. I've selected a small subset of available colors here, and I can use that to identify the color of that border. Now, because this is a brush, you could use a linear gradient, or it'd be weird, you could use a radial gradient, but I'm using a solid color brush here. For the background of everything inside the border, I've currently selected a solid color brush. I can change that color to some other color, and you can see down here where it says background, we have lemon chiffon. But you can also use any other kind of brush for the background, including a linear gradient brush. And you can see when I do that, it updates the markup to include a border.background element, which contains a linear gradient brush element, which contains a linear gradient brush.gradient stops element, which contains multiple gradient stops. Now, right now, both of my colors are Alice blue. That doesn't show much off. Let me change that to beige and burley wood. There we are. I just picked random colors there. And you can see that we have a linear gradient from beige to burley wood. On the left-hand side, we're saying start beige, full beige at 0, and end with full burley wood at 1. But I can change those, and again, I've limited these. These can be any decimal value, to subsets of the possible values. And you can see I've got beige all the way across to 0.25, where the gradient starts, all the way to 0.75, where we have solid burley wood, and from there all the way to the edge, we have solid burley wood. And you can see that's updated here in the markup for that linear gradient brush. And this is nothing specific to the border. It's just how you create linear gradient brushes anywhere. Well, that's about all we can do with this demonstration for the border control. That's about all the properties you'll want to set for the border control. It can contain a single child control, which in this case is a grid. Let's go to the button control and see what it can do. Now, right now, I've set some properties, and we can modify these properties to see how they work. I have, for example, a content property, and I can set the content property to whatever I want. This is a button, and as I type, of course, I'm updating the content down here and the content of the button. I can modify the font size property to be any font size I like. Can modify the font weight property and choose a different font weight. And looks like for this font, thin, extra light, light, and normal all look exactly the same. Maybe for other fonts that may not be the case. For this one it is. For medium looks the same, semi-bold goes to bold, and I think that's all we get. I think we only have 2 different weights available for this particular font. I can enable or disable the button. You can see that right now it's not enabled, then it is enabled. I can set the horizontal alignment to left, center, right, or stretch. Stretch fills the entire horizontal space. I can set the vertical alignment to top, center, bottom, or stretch, in which case the button fills the entire space. I can set the background property. Again, I've limited this to just a small subset of the available colors. I can set the foreground to one of these colors. I can set the border brush to a different color. There we go. So you can see you can make a button look like anything you like just by setting properties. And later, if you learn about creating templates for controls, you can make the button look totally different But just by setting properties, these are the behaviors we can modify. There's one more property that does something rather odd, and that's the click mode property. Right now, the click mode property is set to press. So if I go to this button and click down on the mouse, we have event code that runs and displays you click the button in a message box. Fine. If I change that to release, you can't see it, but I have to click and release the button before that message box appears. We can also set this to hover, which has very odd behavior. Now if I move the mouse over the button, as soon as I move it over the button, the event occurs. You click, the button appears. This probably isn't what users are expecting, so I'd be careful using that option. Users expect this to be set to press, most likely. And I will point out again that the markup for the properties we've selected appears in this window at the bottom, so you can examine the markup to see what it's doing. Let's look at the checkbox control. The checkbox control includes a checkbox and some text. So the content property, I'm a checkbox or something like that, displays the text you specify in the content property. The isChecked property can be set in code to be true or false, and you can come and click on this, and it sets it to true or false. You can click on the text as well. If I set the isThreeState property to true, then I can choose between true, null, and false. That null state is represented by the constant x:null in the markup. And since it's a programmatic constant, we have to have it in curly braces in the markup. I don't need isThreeState set to true for now, so I'll turn it off. I can also specify padding. There's a left padding option. I've limited it to specific values. Obviously, it can be any integer value. And it indicates the distance between the checkbox and the text horizontally, and the checkbox and the text vertically. Again, I've limited this to a small number of values. You can make it whatever you like. You can control that padding horizontally and vertically. We can control the horizontal alignment, which can be left, center, right, or stretched. Well, it is stretched at this point, though it doesn't look like it, because we haven't told it to stretch the text. We've only told it to stretch the entire control. To separate the text from the checkbox, you can use the horizontal content alignment, which tells us to left align the text, to center the text, or right align the text. Stretch doesn't really do much for us. You can center the text while the check portion of it stays left aligned. The same thing goes for vertical alignment. We can use top, center, bottom, or stretch, and once it's set to stretch, I can set the vertical content alignment to move the text portion of this control wherever I like. There's a border brush, so I can control the border color, and you can see it change the border there, and a foreground color, so I can change the color of the text separately. So you have a lot of flexibility when laying out exactly how the checkbox looks on the screen. That checkbox control raises several events that are of interest as well. The events include the checked event that occurs when you check it. There's an unchecked event that occurs when you uncheck the checkbox. There's an indeterminate event that occurs when you set the isThreeState property to true and go to the check option, which is null. And finally, the one you're most likely to use is the click event. That occurs when you change the state of the checkbox. And from within the click event, you can determine what the current state is and take appropriate action. Generally, it's just simplest to use that click event, and as a bonus, this event is guaranteed to never occur because of a markup layout. When creating this example, I had a heck of a time getting the code to work because I was setting properties in the layout and events would occur as I was modifying the layout. Using the click event, that will never occur because the click event can only occur because of a user interaction. You'll want to examine the properties of the control, that is, the isChecked property, to determine why the click event fired. Did it fire because the checkbox was checked, unchecked, or became indeterminate, and you can get that from the isChecked property. Let's move on to talk about the radio button control, which is very similar to the checkbox. The difference is, within a single container, you can select only a single radio button control. You can place multiple radio button controls in multiple containers, and you can only select one per container. Now, you can override this default behavior by setting the group name property, which allows you to set logical containers. You set this string value to create more than one group per container, or to have a single group that spans multiple containers. Let's try an example that demonstrates the radio button control. I've selected the radio button page on our sample project, and you can see a bunch of stuff here. There's text, there's boxes, but on the right I have a container containing checkboxes, and you know ahead of time that I can select as many of those checkboxes as I like. There's no restriction on the number of checkboxes you check within a container. On the left-hand side I have two containers. Each one contains a group of radio button controls. Here I've colored them to indicate the various groups that they belong to. Blue, Group 1, is contained by this container, and there's no group name set, as you can see down here in the markup. For this item, however, I do have a group name set, and it's set to Group 3. So logically, this item is in a different group than these. You can see that because I can only select one at a time from the items labeled Group 1, but I can also select an item named Group 3 because its group is separate than the items in this container. Now down below I have another container, another stack panel, and here I have two groups again. I have Group 2, all of which are defined without a group name setting, and then this item, which has a group name set to Group 3. The group name is just a string, it's arbitrary, it can be whatever you want, but if you make it match some other item, then you can only select one of the items at a time in that group, although I can select here one of the items in Group 2 as well. This allows you to group things physically in containers and group them logically using the group name property.